The hammer was heavier than Harry had expected. Not unreasonably so. It was an ordinary hammer, the kind Arthur Weasley kept in a battered wooden box beneath the kitchen steps, alongside a collection of items he referred to collectively as the Muggle things, spoken always with the same reverence a person might use for rare artifacts or beloved books. The hammer had a wooden handle worn smooth at the grip and a head gone slightly rusty at one edge, and it was, by any measure, a perfectly functional tool. Harry simply hadn't held one in a long time, perhaps ever, properly. The Dursleys had never asked him to fix anything. They had barely acknowledged that he had hands. He turned it over once, feeling the weight shift, and Arthur watched him with the patient expression of a man who had all the time in the world and genuinely believed this to be true. The post on the left has been working itself loose since March, Arthur said, crouching beside the section of fence that ran along the near edge of the garden where the grass grew longest and the gnomes had taken to lurking in the mornings. He pressed one hand flat against the post and gave it a demonstrative wobble. It moved more than a fence post should. Molly keeps asking me to do something about it, and I keep meaning to, but he trailed off, not with embarrassment, but with the easy acceptance of a man who had long made peace with the distance between intention and action. I can do it, Harry said. He hadn't meant to say it quite so quickly. It came out with a readiness that surprised even him. The old instinct, the one that leaned toward yes before the question was finished, toward I'll go, toward let me. He'd spent so many years answering calls before they fully arrived that the habit had become structural, built into the way he held himself. But Arthur only smiled and handed him a short handful of nails from his shirt pocket, and Harry decided it didn't matter why he'd said it. The fence needed fixing. He was here. That was enough. The morning was already warm, the kind of warmth that arrived early in July and settled into everything. The stones of the garden path, the wooden slats of the fence itself, the air sitting heavy and still above the flower beds, where Molly's gnome-deterring charm kept a faint shimmer just above the soil. Harry could hear the distant sound of broom bristles against grass from somewhere beyond the apple trees, a rhythmic sweeping sound that rose and fell and meant Ginny had been up since before either of them. He knelt beside the loose post and looked at it properly. The base had rotted slightly, not badly, not enough to require replacing, but enough that the earth around it had softened and allowed the post to shift. Someone had tried to correct it before, imperfectly, with a nail driven at an angle that had since worked itself nearly all the way out. Harry pulled it free with the back of the hammer. The motion was satisfying in a way he hadn't anticipated. The nail came out cleanly. The trick, Arthur said, settling himself cross-legged in the grass beside the fence, with the ease of a man who had spent considerable time sitting in grass, is to go in at a slight angle. Counterintuitive, but the post stays truer that way. Less give. He demonstrated with his hands, miming the motion. Your grandfather showed me. Before Molly's family stopped speaking to mine, that is. He said this last part pleasantly, as though it was simply an interesting piece of context, and then picked up a long piece of grass and began turning it between his fingers. Harry positioned the first nail. He brought the hammer down, and it glanced sideways, striking the fence post instead of the nail head and leaving a shallow dent in the wood. Ah, Arthur said, not unkindly. Harry repositioned, swung again. This time, the nail went in a centimetre before bending sideways. He sat back on his heels and looked at it. There was a version of this moment, the old version, the version that would have existed a year ago or 2 years ago, or at any point during the long years of moving quickly from one crisis to the next, in which this small failure would have slid off him unnoticed, too minor to register against the scale of everything else that was always happening. A bent nail was nothing. A bent nail was barely real. He had apparated into burning buildings. He had stood in a forest in the dark and walked toward his own death. A bent nail was beneath consideration. But that was the strange thing about the summer. The scale had changed. The burning buildings were gone, and the forest was still, and the nail, the bent, unremarkable, completely inconsequential nail, was suddenly the entire problem. It was the only problem, and he had made a mess of it in approximately 4 seconds. He pulled the bent nail free, dropped it into the grass. "Takes a few tries," Arthur said, in the tone of a man who had bent approximately 400 nails in his lifetime and harbored no ill feeling toward any of them. "The angle's the thing. Once you find it, it becomes automatic." "Right," Harry said. He tried again. This time, the nail went in straight, or nearly. 3 strikes, steady, and the head sat flush against the wood. He looked at it for a moment. Then he reached for the next nail. From beyond the apple trees, Ginny's broom sound had changed. The low, sweeping rhythm replaced by the quick, sharp movement of someone shifting direction suddenly, cutting hard across an invisible line. Harry could picture it without seeing it. The way she leaned into turns, the particular quality of her focus that was different from everyone else's focus, quieter somehow, less performed. He had watched her fly dozens of times over the years, without quite meaning to watch. It was just that she flew the way some people spoke, with a directness that made it easy to pay attention. Ron was probably still asleep. Ron was usually still asleep at this hour, and had been for the past 3 weeks since Harry had arrived at the Burrow. And Hermione had taken to sending letters that arrived at breakfast with increasing frequency, each one presumably containing suggestions about what Ron might do with his time that Ron presumably read and set aside. Harry did not ask about the letters. Ron did not offer. This seemed to work for both of them. He drove in the 3rd nail. Arthur had begun to talk, quietly, at an unhurried pace, the way he talked when there was no particular audience required, and the talking was mostly for the pleasure of the talking itself. He was describing, as best Harry could follow, an encounter at the ministry the previous Tuesday, involving a muggle device called a parking meter, which a colleague had confiscated under the impression that it was enchanted. The colleague had not been entirely wrong, Arthur conceded thoughtfully, because it had in fact accrued several features over the years that were not strictly mechanical. But the question of whether those features had been added deliberately or had simply developed on their own was, he felt, a philosophically interesting one. Objects that people pay a great deal of attention to, Arthur said, sometimes begin to know that they're being attended to. Not magic, exactly. Something adjacent to it. I've always thought. He stopped, reconsidered. Well, Molly thinks I anthropomorphize things. She may have a point. Harry thought of his wand, which had always felt in some way specific to him, in a way he couldn't articulate. and didn't try to now. "It's an interesting idea," he said. "It is, isn't it?" Arthur looked genuinely pleased, in the way he always looked genuinely pleased when someone engaged with one of his theories, as though he had not quite expected it and was delighted to be wrong. "I wrote a small paper on it once. For personal interest only. I knew it would never pass the department. Too many uncomfortable implications for the statute." Harry moved along the fence to the next loose section. There were 3 more posts that needed attention, he could see. One with a split plank below it, 2 more that had shifted in the soil without quite failing yet. He had not particularly noticed the fence before this morning. It was just a fence. But crouching beside it now, with the warm weight of the hammer in his hand, he found he was looking at it closely, at the grain of the wood, the pattern of the previous repairs, the places where someone had painted over a crack rather than mending it. He wondered who had built it originally, whether it had always been slightly imperfect, always requiring this kind of intermittent, patient attention. Probably, he thought. Most things did. Midway through the 4th post, Molly appeared at the kitchen door with 2 mugs and the expression of a woman who had already anticipated every detail of the morning. "Tea," she said, which was not a question. She set both mugs on the flat top of the garden wall and looked at the fence section Harry had completed with the evaluative attention of someone who knew exactly what the fence had looked like before and was now forming a precise opinion about the difference. Whatever she concluded, she kept it to herself, which Harry had come to understand as a form of high praise. "Ginny hasn't come in yet," she said, to neither of them particularly. "Still in the orchard," Arthur said, accepting his mug with both hands. Molly made a sound that communicated, efficiently and without excess syllables, that this was exactly what she had expected, that it was not strictly sensible, and that she had decided not to make anything of it today. Then she went back inside. Harry picked up his mug. The tea was strong and very hot and tasted exactly like every mug of tea that had ever been made in the borough, a consistency that seemed less like repetition and more like a form of constancy, the same tea, the same kitchen, the same unremarkable morning existing in sequence behind all the other mornings. He drank it standing up, looking out across the garden to where the apple trees made a broken green line against the sky. A gnome was watching him from behind the bird bath. He watched it back. After a moment, it decided he was not interesting and disappeared into the long grass with an irritable sound. By the time he had finished the 4th post, the sun had moved far enough across the garden that the shadow of the apple trees had shortened and the broom sounds from the orchard had gone quiet. Harry straightened up. His knees were stiff. There was a half-moon indent on his thumb, where the hammer had connected once, not hard enough to hurt, just enough to feel. He looked at the line of repaired fence. It was not a beautiful fence. It had never been a beautiful fence, but it was sturdier than it had been this morning, and the posts would hold now through the rest of the summer and probably through autumn if the soil stayed dry. The split plank would need replacing eventually. He had pressed it back into alignment and driven a nail through the crosspiece to hold it, but it was a temporary fix, and he knew it, and the fence probably knew it, if Arthur's theory had any merit. He thought about coming back tomorrow to do it properly. The thought arrived plainly, without urgency, without the particular texture of a decision that needed to be made right now or not at all. Just tomorrow, the plank. And then beyond that, vaguely, the recognition that there were probably other things around the burrow that needed the same kind of attention. The slow, unspectacular work of maintenance, of keeping things from getting worse, one small repair at a time. He could do that. "Good work," Arthur said, appearing at his shoulder. He had gone inside at some point, Harry hadn't noticed, and come back out again, and now he stood beside the fence with the same unhurried quality. He brought to everything, looking at the repaired posts with the mild satisfaction of a man whose standards were reasonable and whose definition of a good morning was flexible and forgiving. "I bent 3 nails," Harry said. "4," Arthur said, without any weight to it. "But the ones that went in are solid. That's the thing about fences." He reached out and pressed one hand against the nearest post, testing it. It didn't move. They don't need to be perfect. They just need to hold. He picked up the wooden toolbox and tucked it under his arm. From inside the house, Molly's voice carried out through the open kitchen window, saying something to someone. The words unclear, but the tone ordinary, the tone of daily life simply proceeding. Harry set the hammer in the box. "Same time tomorrow," he said. Arthur looked at him with the expression of a man who had been quietly hoping for exactly this and hadn't wanted to ask. "I'll oil the hinges on the gate," Arthur said. "They've been squeaking since February." Harry nodded. He picked up both empty mugs from the garden wall and carried them toward the kitchen door. From somewhere above the orchard, a red-tailed broom cut a clean line across the pale morning sky, and then turned and came back again. The kitchen was already warm when Harry came downstairs. Not the warmth of a fire recently lit or a window left open to the morning. It was the deeper warmth of a room that had been in use for some time, that had absorbed the heat of the stove and the steam from the kettle, and the particular quality of attention that Molly Weasley brought to everything she did in this room. It settled against Harry's skin as he reached the bottom step, the way warmth does when you move from a cool corridor into somewhere inhabited, and he stood for a moment in the doorway without quite meaning to, taking it in. Molly was at the stove. She had her back to him, her hair pinned up with 2 or 3 things that were probably not intended as hairpins, but had been recruited as such, her wand tucked into the pocket of her apron, where it made a slight angular outline against the fabric. She was moving between the stove and the counter with the efficiency of someone who had performed these exact motions so many times they had ceased to require thought, lifting a lid, setting it down, reaching for something without looking, finding it. The wireless on the shelf above the bread bin was murmuring at a volume just below comprehension, a low current of voice and occasional music that seemed less like something to listen to and more like a property of the room itself. She did not turn around when Harry entered, but she said, "There's tea in the pot," with the certainty of someone who had heard him coming down the stairs and had already accounted for him. "Thanks," Harry said. He found a mug on the draining board. There were always mugs on the draining board, a permanent rotation of them in various stages of drying, and filled it from the earthenware teapot that sat on the far end of the counter with a crocheted cozy pulled over it in faded orange. The tea was hot and had been steeping for several minutes and was stronger than he usually made it himself. But he had stopped noticing that weeks ago. He had simply adjusted somewhere between the first day and the seventh, and now burro tea tasted like the correct version. He leaned against the counter and looked at the kitchen. It was, by any external measure, a chaotic room. The ceiling was lower than was strictly comfortable for someone of even average height, and the shelves that ran along two of the walls were occupied by things that had accumulated rather than been arranged. Stacked plates of mismatched sizes, jars with handwritten labels, a collection of cookbooks with broken spines that leaned against one another for support, a clock whose face bore the names of the Weasley family in a careful hand, and whose hands pointed, this morning, mostly at home, with one, Percy's, hovering uncertainly between home and work as it often did. Several enchanted implements occupied the far corner of the counter and were in various states of autonomous activity, a knife making slow preparatory movements above a chopping board, a wooden spoon standing upright in a bowl of something that didn't yet require stirring, but was being monitored. And yet it didn't feel chaotic. It felt, Harry thought, the way a place feels when everything in it is there because it is used, not arranged, not displayed, just present, taking up exactly the space it needed and no more. Molly turned from the stove with a bowl in her arms and set it on the table, and then looked at Harry with the brief assessing glance that she applied to everyone who appeared in her kitchen in the mornings. A glance that was simultaneously maternal and pragmatic and over almost before it registered. "Sit down if you like," she said, "or you can make yourself useful." She said it the way she said most things, without pressure, without the implication that either option would be judged, simply as an accurate description of the available choices. Harry sat down briefly, then stood back up again. "What needs doing?" She gave him the carrots without ceremony. A pile of them, pulled from the garden that morning by the look of the soil still clinging to their ends, laid on the chopping board with a short-bladed knife beside them. No instructions beyond a slight inclination of her head toward the knife, which was instruction enough. Harry picked it up and started at the top of the first carrot. He was not a particularly skilled cook. He had learned necessity at the Dursleys. He could follow a recipe, manage heat, keep things from burning. But it was the cooking of someone who had been taught by consequence rather than by anyone who wanted him to learn. Molly's kitchen asked for something different. Not skill exactly. Something more like participation. He cut the carrot into rounds, unevenly at first, then more consistently as his hand found the rhythm of it. Molly moved behind him, around him, in the particular way of someone accustomed to sharing a kitchen, fluid and unhurried, the kind of movement that neither required acknowledgement nor resented it. She did not narrate what she was doing. She did not ask Harry questions about how he was sleeping, or how he was feeling, or what he planned to do with himself, which was something Harry had quietly come to understand as a specific kindness. The question of what Harry planned to do with himself was one he did not currently have an answer to, and being in a room where it was not asked felt like being somewhere he could breathe at a normal rate. The wireless murmured on, something in the style of something old, a melody that moved without urgency. "George came down at 2:30, Molly said, not looking up from the pastry she was rolling. She said it neutrally, in the tone of a woman reporting the weather. "Couldn't sleep." Harry kept cutting. Did he eat something? I left bread and butter on the table before I went up. He found it. A pause, the rolling pin moving steadily. He usually does. This was how she spoke about George now, sideways, in the margins of other sentences, in a tone that neither asked for response nor deflected it. Harry had noticed this in his first week at the Burrow, and had not known how to navigate it, had felt the familiar uselessness of having nothing adequate to say. He had stopped trying to find adequate things to say around the middle of June. Now he just listened and occasionally replied and let that be enough. He was working on something in the shed yesterday, Harry offered. I could hear him from the fence. Molly looked up. Could you? She said. It was not a question. It was more like something settling, a small fact being added to a larger arrangement of small facts that she was quietly keeping track of, the way she kept track of everything related to her family, not intrusively but constantly, the way you keep track of weather when you spend a lot of time outside. Yes, Harry said. And then, because it seemed like the kind of detail that might matter, for a while. Molly nodded once and went back to her rolling. Outside, the morning moved. The shadow of the garden wall shortened as the sun rose, and the light came through the kitchen window at a lower angle, warming the wooden table in a way that shifted slowly across the grain. A family of sparrows had been conducting an ongoing dispute in the hedge since Harry had come downstairs, and their argument went on without resolution or escalation, just the same 6 or 7 sharp sounds in varying combinations. Ron would sleep until 9, at least. Hermione's most recent letter was on the kitchen table under the salt pot, as Ron had left it last night, not unopened, just resting there. Its presence, the result of someone meaning to reply later and not having done it yet. Harry could read Hermione's handwriting from where he sat, partial lines visible below the fold. The word practically appeared twice. The phrase, "you really should," appeared once. He looked at something else. "Pass me that," Molly said, indicating a jar on the shelf to Harry's left, with a slight gesture of her flour-dusted hand. He passed it. She unscrewed the lid without looking and shook dried thyme into the bowl with the experienced imprecision of someone who had long since abandoned measuring. "Your chopping's improved," she said. Harry looked down at the board. The carrot rounds were even, consistent, the pile neat without having been arranged. "Ron holds the knife wrong," she added, in a tone that suggested this was a long-standing and accepted feature of Ron's existence, rather than a criticism. "Arthur holds it correctly, but his mind wanders. I've lost count of the number of times I've had to send him out for more onions." She set the thyme jar down. "You pay attention." Harry didn't know what to say to this, so he started on the next carrot. He did pay attention, he supposed. It was less a virtue than a habit developed out of necessity. Years of watching the way a room shifted, who was near what exit, where the tension was gathering. He had spent so long attending to environments as a matter of survival that the habit had simply continued into quieter circumstances, and found, rather to his surprise, that it was also useful for things like cutting carrots. The pressure of the knife, the resistance of the vegetable, the exact point at which the blade met the board. He found, not for the first time this summer, that he did not entirely know which parts of himself were useful anymore, which reflexes were still relevant. The constant vigilance had made sense when there was something to be vigilant about. He wasn't sure what to do with it, now that there wasn't, except, apparently, to cut carrots with reasonable consistency. He supposed there were worse outcomes. At 8:30, Ginny appeared in the kitchen doorway, still in her Quidditch kit, grass-stained at the knees, her hair coming loose from its plait, carrying her broom across one shoulder in the casual way of someone who had forgotten it was there. She assessed the kitchen in the quick, comprehensive way that was distinct to her, the way she looked at a pitch before flying it, and then moved directly to the teapot. "Morning," she said, to the room in general. "There are boots for a reason," Molly said, without looking. Ginny looked down at her feet, which were, Harry noted, leaving faint grass-green impressions on the flagstone floor, and then leaned her broom against the wall and retreated to the back step to remove them. She came back in her socks, poured tea, and sat across from Harry with the comfortable directness of someone who did not require any particular fanfare to enter a room or occupy a seat in it. She looked at his pile of carrots. "You're up early," she said. "Couldn't sleep past 6. "Same." She wrapped both hands around her mug. "I've been going out since 5 most mornings. It's the best time. The light's different." Harry thought about asking what she meant. The light's different in what way, for what purpose? And then didn't, because he thought he probably understood. The early morning had its own quality, a stillness that existed briefly before the day accumulated its ordinary weight. You went out into it, and something about the going out felt like a choice, made before anyone else was watching, which gave it a slightly different character. "I noticed," he said, "from the fence yesterday." She looked at him steadily, in the way she had of looking at things she was actually interested in, without decoration. "Were you watching?" "I was fixing the fence." "You can do both." He acknowledged this with a slight inclination of his head, and she smiled briefly over the rim of her mug and looked at something else, and the morning went on. By the time the carrots were done and a second, smaller task, halving a bowl of small potatoes, had been completed and also handed to Molly, the kitchen had begun to expand. The sounds of the house were changing above them. Footsteps, the particular groan of a specific stair that Harry had learned to identify as the second from the top. A door. Arthur appeared at 9:30 with his hair uncombed and the expression of a man who had slept adequately but not extravagantly, and was pleased enough with the result. "Morning," he said, and went to the teapot. Percy arrived shortly after, already dressed with the completeness of someone who had decided what kind of day it was going to be from the moment he woke up. He sat at the table with a small stack of papers and a quill and worked through them at a pace that suggested the papers were being reviewed rather than read, checking, confirming, moving on. He said, "Good morning," once, clearly, to the room, and then did not say anything else for 20 minutes, and no one asked him to. The kitchen filled and moved around itself. Molly produced things from the stove, and people collected them. Someone refilled the teapot. The sparrows in the hedge reached some kind of temporary agreement and went quiet, and in their absence, Harry became aware of the sound of the garden, the distant hum of Arthur's enchanted lawnmower that ran itself in slow, diagonal rows along the back lawn on Tuesdays and Fridays, the intermittent sound of wind moving through the apple trees. He ate his breakfast and listened to the kitchen. After a while, he got up and brought his plate to the sink and washed it, because that was a thing people did in the Weasley kitchen. You washed your own plate, and sometimes the plate beside yours, if the person it belonged to was still eating, and you set it on the draining board and it dried itself at a gentle pace and returned eventually to the shelf. It was not a complicated system. It required no instruction. He washed his plate, set it on the board. Molly was at the other end of the counter now, doing something that required a great deal of concentration, and did not look up, but said, "Thank you, Harry." She said it the way she said, "There's tea in the pot," plainly, without the weight of something larger being communicated, just the thing itself. "Morning was good," he said, not quite sure what he meant by it, only that it was true. She did look up then, briefly, with an expression he couldn't fully read, not a smile exactly, something smaller, something that lived in the area around the eyes, and then went back to her work. Harry dried his hands on the kitchen towel. Outside the window, the garden lay in the late morning light. The lawnmower moved in its slow diagonal. The apple trees made their sound. The fence he had fixed yesterday was visible from here, its repaired posts standing in their proper alignment, unremarkable and sufficient. He would need to go back for that split plank, but not yet, not this minute. This minute the kitchen was warm and the tea was strong, and somewhere above him the house was moving through its ordinary morning, and there was nothing required of him except to be in it. He stayed a little longer. The grass in the orchard had grown long enough to bend. Not untended, Arthur ran the enchanted mower along the back lawn twice a week with quiet regularity. But the orchard was its own territory, separate from the lawn's jurisdiction, and the grass there was allowed to do what it liked. It grew in uneven patches between the apple trees, longer in the shade, shorter where the ground rose slightly and the soil thinned, seeded through with clover and something yellow-flowered that Harry didn't know the name of. When he lowered himself into it, the grass came up past his wrists. Ron had already chosen his spot, a shallow hollow between two roots where the ground was level and the shade fell consistently from the nearest tree. He had brought a blanket that he had not spread out so much as dropped, and he was lying on it with one arm across his face, in the manner of someone who had not quite decided whether he was going to sleep or simply rest with his eyes closed. His shoes were already off. He had been in this position for approximately 4 minutes. Harry sat nearby, his back against the tree, and looked up through the branches. The apple trees were old. Their trunks had the thick, slightly irregular quality of things that had grown without being directed, branches going in the directions they chose rather than the directions that would have been tidy. The apples were still green, weeks from ripeness, hanging in clusters that turned slightly in the light wind. The leaves were the dark, saturated green of midsummer, and the light coming through them had the dappled, shifting quality that made it difficult to look at directly, always just slightly moving, never settling. From somewhere above and to the left, Ginny was flying. He didn't need to see her to know it was her. He had learned, in the weeks since arriving, to distinguish the sound of her flying from the ambient sounds of the orchard, the specific rhythm of someone who knew exactly what they were doing and was not being careful about it. She was practicing turns, he thought, fast ones, the kind that required the broom to tilt sharply and the body to follow with a fraction of a second's delay, committing to the angle before it was entirely safe to commit. Ron made a sound that might have been the beginning of a word and then resolved into something more like a sigh, and was quiet again. Harry did not feel the need to say anything. This was one of the things the summer had given him without his having asked for it. The gradual discovery that silence with Ron was not a silence that required filling. They had always been this way to some extent, he thought. There was a particular ease between them that was different from the ease between Harry and Hermione, which was warmer but also more active, more occupied with the exchange of things. With Ron, ease meant the absence of requirement. You could be in the same place doing nothing in particular, and the nothing in particular was sufficient. They had spent 3 afternoons in the orchard now, in this loose, unplanned way, not arranged in advance, simply converging here when the morning's tasks were finished, and the afternoon opened up ahead of them, with its unhurried hours. Ron always brought the blanket. Harry always forgot to bring anything, and then sat on the grass directly, which was fine. The grass was dry this time of year. Above them, Ginny's broom cut left, hard and sudden. Harry tracked the sound of it without looking up. The slight compression of air, the broom's bristles in the turn, then the return, then the pause that meant she was hovering somewhere above the near tree and considering the next line. Ron moved his arm off his face and squinted upward. "She's been at it since breakfast," he said. "I know. Mum thinks she needs to eat more. Your mum thinks everyone needs to eat more." "True." Ron put his arm back. "She's been invited to train with Gwennock Jones's side. Did she tell you?" Harry looked over. "No. She probably wasn't going to yet." Ron said this without any particular significance, just information being placed down between them. "She hasn't decided. She keeps saying she's thinking about it, and then she comes out here and flies for 3 hours." Harry looked back up at the branches. He thought about what Ginny deciding would look like, the particular quality of her decision-making, which he had observed enough times to recognize. She did not decide the way some people decided, with visible deliberation and the working through of options. She decided somewhere beneath the surface, and then one day the decision was simply made, and she moved forward with a completeness that suggested it had been made for longer than she'd said. He wondered if she had already decided, if the flying was less about thinking and more about something else, burning through something or honoring something, or simply doing the things she loved before the structure of a team and a schedule and a coach's expectations was laid over the top of it. He didn't ask. It wasn't his to ask. The afternoon went on. A cloud moved across the sun and the orchard dimmed briefly, the green of the grass going darker for a moment, and then the cloud passed and the light came back. Something in the hedge at the orchard's edge rustled, probably a gnome, investigating, deciding against it. The wireless from the kitchen window was just barely audible from here, a thread of sound that dissolved before it arrived. Ron fell asleep. Harry knew because the quality of his breathing changed, deepened and steadied, the slight tension that existed in even a resting body releasing into something heavier. His arms slid off his face. He looked, in sleep, younger than he did awake, which was true of most people, Harry thought. The waking face carried things. Sleep set them down for a while. Harry did not sleep. He was not, these days, able to sleep in the afternoons. His body had retained some reluctance about it, some old insistence on staying oriented to the waking world, which the mind healer Hermione had found for him in April had said was common and would ease. He took her word for it. In the meantime, he was awake while Ron slept, which was fine. There were worse things than being awake in an orchard in July. He turned a small piece of bark over in his fingers. It had come off the tree at his back, loose already, peeling in the way of old bark, its underside pale and slightly damp where it had been against the trunk. He turned it over, feeling the different textures, the rough outer surface, the smoother inner curve, the slight give of it where the wood was beginning to soften. He set it down, picked it up again, set it back on the ground. Above him, Ginny had stopped flying. The cessation of sound arrived suddenly enough that he looked up. The orchard was still, just the leaves and the light through them, and the apples in their green clusters, and Ron breathing steadily in the hollow. Then her broom appeared through the lower branches, not diving, just descending at a shallow angle, moving through the shade at the unhurried pace of someone coming home. She landed in the grass 15 feet away without any particular ceremony, stepped off the broom, and sat down cross-legged where she was, setting the broom beside her. She looked at Ron. "Asleep?" "About 10 minutes ago," Harry said. She nodded. She had the flushed, bright-eyed quality of someone who had been physically exerting themselves in open air. Her plait was coming apart again, loose pieces of hair along her face, her cheeks slightly pink. She pulled an apple from the nearest low branch, still green, still weeks from ready, and looked at it and put it back. "How's the fence?" she asked, holding. "Dad looked pleased at dinner last night." "He always looks pleased." "He looks more pleased," she said, with the precision of someone who knew the difference. She stretched one leg out in front of her and turned her face up toward the light. "He likes having someone out there with him. He doesn't say, but—" Harry looked at the branch above him. A bee was investigating one of the unripe apples with methodical patience, moving around its circumference, finding nothing yet, persisting anyway. "I'm going back tomorrow," he said. "There's a split plank I left." Ginny made a sound of acknowledgement, not particularly interested in the plank specifically, simply noting the fact of it. She had an ease about her in the orchard, he thought, different from the focused quality she had when she was flying, less directed, more open. Her shoulders had dropped. The deliberate quality she carried in her eyes when she was thinking about something had softened. She looked, he thought, like someone who was not thinking about anything in particular. He wondered how she did that. He wondered if it was something you learned or something you had. Ron woke up at some point. Harry wasn't sure exactly when, had lost track of time in the way that was possible here, in the particular undifferentiated quality of a summer afternoon, and sat up with the hair on one side of his head bent into an improbable shape, and announced that he was hungry. "You ate an hour ago," Ginny said. "That was an hour ago." She threw a piece of bark at him. He caught it without looking, which was the kind of thing Ron did sometimes that reminded Harry of why he was actually an excellent keeper when he trusted himself to be, and dropped it in the grass. "Mum'll have something on," he said, standing up and shaking out the blanket with a snap that sent seeds and bits of grass into the air. "Coming." Ginny shook her head. "In a bit." Ron looked at Harry, who also shook his head. Ron accepted this without comment, folded the blanket loosely under his arm, and made his way back through the orchard toward the house, his footsteps audible in the long grass and then fading. The orchard was quiet again. Ginny had picked up her broom and was running her hand along the handle in the automatic way of someone checking something. They've checked 1,000 times, not looking for anything, just keeping contact. The light had shifted, lower now, the shadows longer under the trees, the green of everything a shade deeper than it had been at midday. Harry stayed where he was. There was nothing to do. There was nowhere to be. There was only the orchard and the light moving through it and the small sounds of an afternoon going on. And he was in the middle of it, just sitting, and nothing was required. He leaned his head back against the bark. The apples turned, barely, in the light wind. He stayed until Ginny stood up, said dinner soon in the direction of his general vicinity, and walked back toward the house with her broom at her shoulder. And even then, he stayed a few minutes longer, alone in the long grass, watching the light go on changing in the leaves. The shed door had a particular sound when it opened. Not a squeak exactly. Arthur had oiled the hinges sometime in May, Harry had been told, though the results suggested either the oil had been insufficient or the hinges had opinions about being oiled. It was more of a low, deliberate complaint, the sound of metal that had been in the same position for a long time and was noting, without real objection, that it was being asked to move. Harry had come to associate the sound with a specific quality of evening, the hour when the garden went amber and the air cooled at the edges, and Arthur disappeared from the kitchen table with the unhurried purposefulness of a man moving towards something he had been thinking about all day. Tonight Harry had followed him, not with any particular plan. He had been sitting on the back step with his mug after dinner, watching the light do what it did to the garden in the last hour before it went, and Arthur had come through the door behind him with his jacket on and the wooden toolbox under his arm, and had said simply, "Coming," and Harry had set down his mug and gone. The shed was larger inside than its outside suggested, in the way of many things at the Burrow that had been added to incrementally over decades without reference to original plans. 2 deep shelves ran the length of the far wall, their contents a dense and varied accumulation of objects in various states of function, some clearly Muggle in origin, identifiable by shape or material, others less classifiable, things whose purpose was either self-evident to someone with sufficient knowledge or entirely opaque to someone without it. A single lamp hung from the low ceiling and gave off a warm, slightly amber light that fell unevenly across everything. Arthur set the toolbox on the workbench and opened it with the ease of long habit. "I've been meaning to sort this shelf for some time," he said, nodding toward the left-hand shelf, which was occupied by a collection of objects in no discernible order. "Every summer I say I'll get to it." Harry looked at the shelf. There was what appeared to be a transistor radio with its back panel missing, a coil of rubber tubing, 3 objects that might have been torches in various states of disassembly, a glass jar containing small metal pieces, a thing that was almost certainly a stapler but had been modified in some way Harry couldn't immediately identify, a length of electrical wire, and something orange and spherical that he couldn't place at all. "What's the orange thing?" he said. Arthur looked where Harry was looking and his face arranged itself into the particular expression it adopted when confronted with one of his more interesting acquisitions. Pleasure at the question, combined with the slight wariness of someone about to describe something they know, will raise further questions. "A tennis ball," he said. "Enchanted. It returns to whoever throws it," which is not, I believe, the original design specification. He picked it up, turned it over. "I've been trying to work out whether the enchantment was deliberate or emergent." "Emergent," Harry said, because Arthur's theory from the fence post came back to him. Objects that people pay a great deal of attention to, and it seemed consistent. Arthur looked at him with clear satisfaction. "My thinking exactly. Though Perkins at the office maintains the enchantment was placed. He thinks a child did it, probably by accident. A Muggle child." "Can Muggle children do that?" "Strictly speaking, no." Arthur set the tennis ball down. "But strictly speaking covers rather less than most people assume." He reached for the nearest object, one of the torch-like things, and examined it with the focused attention of a man renewing an old acquaintance. "Now, this one I do know. It's called a penlight. American, I think. Someone left it on the Hogwarts Express in 1987, and it ended up in the lost property at the Ministry, and eventually, through a series of administrative steps I won't bore you with. Here." He handed it to Harry. Harry turned it over. It was a thin metal cylinder, slightly dented at one end, with a small glass circle at the tip. He pressed the button on the side. Nothing happened. "Batteries," Arthur said, with the satisfied tone of someone using the correct term. "It requires small portable power cells inside the casing. Extraordinary idea. Entirely self-contained energy source." "We have those in the wizarding world," Harry said. "Sort of. Wands." Arthur considered this with genuine interest. "I've thought about that comparison. Though the mechanism is rather different, isn't it? A wand channels something that's already present. A battery stores something that was gathered elsewhere." He took the penlight back and turned it over in his hands. "I find that distinction interesting, the philosophy of it." Harry thought about this for a moment, the difference between channeling and storing, between something present and something gathered. He turned it over in his mind without arriving anywhere in particular, and decided it was the kind of thought that didn't require arriving somewhere. "Where does magic come from?" he said. Not urgently, just the question, placed into the air of the shed the way Arthur had placed his theories about the parking meter, lightly, for the pleasure of considering it. Arthur set the penlight down and was quiet for a moment, which was not the quiet of someone who didn't have an answer, but the quiet of someone deciding which part of a large answer to give. "No one entirely knows," he said. "There are theories, most of them circular." He reached for the jar of small metal pieces and unscrewed the lid, peering in. "I've always thought it's less like a substance and more like a tendency, a predisposition in certain materials and certain people toward a particular kind of responsiveness." He selected a small metal piece, examined it, set it aside. "But that's not a popular position at the Ministry. Too abstract, too inconvenient. It implies that the boundaries between magical and non-magical are less fixed than the statute requires them to be." He said this without bitterness, just the calm observation of a man who had held an unpopular position for a long time and made peace with it. "Which they are, of course, but there are entire departments whose existence depends on the fixedness. Harry nodded. He was leaning against the workbench, hands in his pockets, and the shed had settled into a particular quality of evening. The amber lamp, the smell of oil and old wood, the sounds of the garden. Going quieter outside the single window. Through the glass, he could see the sky had turned the deep, saturated blue of the hour before dark. The apple trees a dark silhouette against it. They worked through the shelf without urgency. Arthur narrated as they went, not continuously, not performing, but in the way of someone thinking aloud to compatible company, naming objects and their origins and occasional theories about their histories. Harry mostly listened, asking a question when one presented itself, which Arthur received each time with the same unaffected pleasure, as though the questions confirmed something he had hoped but not assumed. The transistor radio, found on the Hogwarts Express platform, 1980-something, brought to the ministry by a well-meaning muggle who thought it had been left behind. Partially functional, the signal it received was not precisely radio. Arthur had never been able to determine what it was receiving, only that it was something, and that the something changed on alternate Tuesdays, which he found intriguing. The rubber tubing, entirely ordinary, kept because it was useful. The stapler, modified by one of the twins, Fred, Arthur thought, though he had been wrong before, to staple things to a level of permanence far exceeding the original design. He had used it once by accident and spent an afternoon with a removal charm before managing to separate the papers. Harry picked up the stapler, examined it, set it in the far corner of the shelf by itself, where Arthur laughed quietly. The wire, ordinary. The torch casings, 3 of them, all the same model, which Arthur suspected was not coincidence. He had a theory about torch casings specifically that he began to outline and then caught himself with an expression of mild self-consciousness. "You don't need to hear all of this," he said. "I don't mind," Harry said, and meant it. Arthur looked at him briefly. A direct look, brief and assessing in the way that Arthur's looks occasionally were, beneath the general warmth of his manner, the look of a man who was paying more attention than he usually showed. Then he went back to the wire and continued his theory about torch casings, which turned out to involve the behavior of light in spaces that had been magically modified. Outside, a wood pigeon settled in the apple trees and made its low sound twice and was quiet. At some point, Harry realized he had not checked the window in several minutes. This was notable because checking the window, the door, the peripheral spaces, the places from which something could approach, was something he did without thinking, or had done without thinking, for so long that the absence of it was now the thing that required noticing. He became aware of the absence the way you become aware of a sound that has stopped, not during it, but in the sudden quiet after. He was standing in a shed, in a garden, at the Burrow, with Arthur Weasley, who was explaining the philosophical implications of the rubber tubing now, which turned out to have some, unexpectedly. Nothing was coming through the window. He turned the tennis ball over in his hand. He had picked it up again without noticing, and felt its slight returning weight, the enchantment in it like a held breath, patient and complete. "Molly says you've been sleeping better," Arthur said. He said it in exactly the tone he used for everything else. The same unhurried lateral quality laid into the conversation without ceremony. not a question, not an opening for a particular kind of response. "A bit," Harry said. "The fence helps," Arthur said, now examining the torch casings again. "In my experience, having something that wants doing, something small." He set one casing down, picked up another. "During the last war, the first one I mean, I couldn't sleep for months after. I fixed every squeaking door in the house. Molly thought I'd lost my mind." He smiled briefly at the casing. "Every hinge, every latch, every cupboard door in the kitchen that had ever so much as caught." He set it down. "Slept fine after that." Harry looked at the window. The deep blue of the sky had given way to something darker now, the apple trees fully silhouetted. The lamp in the shed made the glass reflective. "There are probably enough doors in this house," Harry said. "More than enough," Arthur agreed. "And if you run out, I'll find you more." They finished the shelf. Not completely. The orange tennis ball went back, and the transistor radio, because Arthur was not done with either of them. But the rest was organized, or organized enough, which Arthur seemed to find satisfying in a proportionate and unexaggerated way. He closed the toolbox. He turned off the lamp. They stood for a moment in the shed doorway, while Harry's eyes adjusted to the blue dark of the garden. The burrow was lit from inside, warm yellow in the kitchen windows, a dimmer light in the sitting room above. Somewhere in the kitchen, the wireless was still murmuring. Smoke from the chimney went straight up in the still evening air. Harry thought, "I know this house now, where the stairs creak, which window sticks in the heat, the way the kitchen smells on a morning before anyone comes down." He had been here enough times over the years, but knowing it was different, knowing it was the result of being present in it in ordinary time, not arrive for crisis time, not guest time, just time. Arthur's hand found his shoulder briefly, the gesture of a man not given to large demonstrations, but given, on occasion, to small ones. And then he was moving toward the kitchen door, saying something about tea, and Harry followed him across the dark garden toward the lit windows. The shed door swung shut behind them with its low, familiar sound. Dinner at the Burrow was never quiet, not in the way of houses where quiet was the default and noise an interruption. Here it was the reverse, noise the natural state of things, the particular noise of a family that had always been large and had learned to occupy sound the way other families occupied space. Voices overlapped without apology. Requests for things to be passed traveled across the table in various directions simultaneously. Someone was always getting up for something. Someone else was always just sitting down. Harry had eaten at this table more times than he could count. But this summer was different. This summer, he was not visiting. He was simply here, present in the ordinary mechanics of it, and the difference had taken some getting used to, not because the table had changed, but because he had, or was changing, or was in the process of whatever it was that was happening to him that the mind healer referred to as integration, and Harry thought of, when he thought of it at all, as learning to sit down without expecting to have to stand back up immediately. Tonight, there were 7 of them. Arthur at the head of the table with his sleeves rolled to the elbows, the way he always was at dinner, as though the day's work was still technically ongoing. Molly moving between table and stove with the final pieces of the meal, declining every offer of help with the practiced efficiency of someone who had long since determined that help in this particular phase was more disruptive than useful. Ginny beside Harry, her hair down and still slightly damp at the ends from a wash after the orchard. Ron across from Harry, having located his appetite approximately 4 times today, and now arriving at dinner with a focused application of someone with serious intentions. Percy at the corner of the table, George at the other end. Percy had arrived mid-afternoon with a leather satchel and the purposeful quality of a man who had made several decisions before crossing the threshold. He had come into the kitchen, said hello. Mum, with the careful warmth of someone choosing their words, set the satchel down and allowed himself to be fed a biscuit. Molly had not made anything of it. She had simply handed him the biscuit and gone back to whatever she was doing, which Percy had accepted with something in his eyes that was possibly relief. He was seated now with the satchel under his chair, his hands on the table, doing a careful job of appearing natural. George had come in from the shed at 6:30 without being called, which was notable, Harry knew from weeks of observation, in that George generally required either calling or the smell of food being at a sufficient stage of readiness to travel outdoors. He had washed his hands at the kitchen sink, taken his usual seat at the far end of the table, and begun rearranging the salt and pepper pots in a pattern whose logic was not apparent to anyone watching, which was something he did when he was in a particular kind of mood. Not a bad one, just an inward one, occupied with something interior. He had not looked at Percy directly. Percy had not looked at George directly. Molly set the large dish in the center of the table and sat down. Dinner proceeded. Things were passed. The dish went around. Arthur asked Ron a question about something Ron had mentioned at breakfast, and Ron answered it with more detail than the question had strictly required, which was a sign he was comfortable, and Arthur listened with the full attention he gave to everything anyone said to him, which was one of the things about Arthur that Harry found. He could simply watch, sometimes, without tiring of it. Ginny said something about the Holyhead Harriers that prompted Ron to say something comparative about the Chudley Cannons, that prompted Ginny to give him a look of measured assessment that communicated, efficiently, that the comparison did not flatter the Cannons. Ron accepted this look with the equanimity of a lifelong Cannon supporter who had developed a philosophical relationship with disappointment. Harry ate and listened. Percy, beside Arthur, spoke carefully. Short contributions, precisely worded, laid into gaps in the conversation with the slight over-deliberateness of someone who was monitoring the volume and placement of his own voice. He was not uncomfortable exactly, Harry thought. He was trying in the visible, slightly effortful way of someone who knew that trying was both necessary and insufficient, but was doing it anyway, which Harry recognized as a form of courage that didn't look like courage from the outside. George was eating steadily, his rearrangement of the condiments complete. The result apparently satisfactory. He said nothing for the first part of the meal. Then Ron, in the way that Ron sometimes moved through conversations without complete awareness of where he was going, mentioned something about a Muggle product he'd seen in a joke shop in London, described it without particular context, just something he'd found amusing. And George looked up. "Doesn't work," George said. I looked into something similar. The mechanism's wrong for what they're trying to do. A brief silence. Not uncomfortable, brief. The length of time it took for the table to note the fact of George speaking unprompted about something product-related and to quietly decide to let it land normally. What would work? Ron asked, in the exact tone of someone asking a genuine question. George considered. Different delivery system, he said. What they've got creates the effect too fast. You want a delay. Delay is funnier. He picked up his fork again. It's basic timing. Ron nodded. Arthur nodded. Ginny passed the bread. Percy said, "There's a Muggle comedian. I read about him in a Muggle Studies supplementary text years ago, who wrote about timing. He said comedy was architecture. He said it into the middle distance, not quite to George, not quite to the table. The shape of the pause. A beat. That's not terrible, George said, to his plate. Percy looked at his own plate. Thank you, he said, with careful neutrality. It was not a reconciliation. It was not a moment. It was two sentences, placed down next to each other and left there. But Harry had been watching, and he thought it was something. The very small beginning of something. The first post driven into the ground before the fence could be built. And he had learned enough about fences this summer to know that was how it started. One thing holding, then another. Molly brought out pudding. The conversation lost its structure, as it always did at this stage of dinner. Redistributed into smaller channels, 2 or 3 conversations running in parallel. The table's formality dissolving into the easier register of people who had stopped being hungry and were now simply in the same room together. Arthur was telling Percy something about the ministry's new filing system with an expression that conveyed patient bewilderment, and Percy was listening with the expression of someone who understood the filing system and was deciding whether to explain it or simply commiserate. Ron had turned sideways in his chair with the physical ease of someone entirely at home, talking to Harry about something that had started as Quidditch and had become, without clear transition, a detailed description of a dream Ron had had involving a library that kept rearranging itself. Ginny was watching George. Not obviously. Harry noticed because he was sitting beside her and he had learned to read the slight adjustments of her attention. The way she kept her face toward Ron and Harry's conversation while the quality of her focus was oriented elsewhere. The way she was tracking something without appearing to. George had his pudding in front of him and was eating it with the same inward quality as earlier, not withdrawn, just occupied with something that lived below the surface. He was present. He was here. And that, Harry thought, from what Ginny had told him in quiet, peripheral ways over the past weeks, was not always a given. There were evenings George did not come down. There were mornings he left before anyone was up and didn't come back until the house was dark. Tonight, he was here. Ginny reached across the table and put a small second portion of pudding on George's plate, without asking, without looking at him, without making it a thing. George looked at the extra pudding. He looked at Ginny, who was looking at Ron. He ate the pudding. After the table cleared slowly. This was another thing Harry had come to understand about the rhythm of the burrow. Dinner did not end precisely, it dissolved. Plates went to the sink by stages, the enchanted washing up proceeding at its own pace. People moved to the sitting room or the garden or stayed at the table with another cup of tea and no particular agenda. The wireless came on at a slightly higher volume. Arthur found his newspaper. Ron fell into the armchair with the devoted inevitability of someone returning to their natural habitat. Harry stayed at the table. He had a mug of tea that Molly had placed in front of him during the clearing process, and he drank it slowly, watching the kitchen return to itself. The quiet, post-dinner state it settled into each night, familiar now in every detail. The dish drying above the sink, the lamp at the low setting, the faint sound of Arthur's newspaper from the sitting room. Percy appeared in the doorway, satchel over his shoulder, jacket on. He caught Harry's eye briefly, the look of someone pausing at the border of a room they had already decided to leave. "Good night, Harry," he said. "Night," Harry said. Percy nodded once, that careful, precise nod, and said goodbye to Molly in the kitchen doorway, and was gone, the front door closing behind him with the particular sound of the burrow's front door, which had a latch that required a specific pressure to catch properly. Molly stood at the kitchen window for a moment. Harry looked at his tea. "He'll come back, sooner, next time," Molly said, to the window, or possibly to herself, or possibly just to the kitchen. Then she turned back to the sink. From the sitting room, Arthur laughed at something in the newspaper. A sudden, surprised laugh, the kind that escapes before it can be moderated. Ron's voice rose briefly in inquiry. Arthur read something aloud, too low for Harry to catch the words. Ginny came in from the garden and stood at the back door shaking grass off her socks and said, without looking up, "Did Percy leave?" "Just now," Harry said. She got the grass off, mostly, and padded across the kitchen and leaned against the counter and looked at the sitting room doorway and the sounds coming through it. She looked in the lamplight, like someone watching something she was fond of. "Better than last time," she said. "He stayed for pudding." Harry considered. "He made a joke, sort of." Ginny looked at him. "He didn't." "About timing. George said it wasn't terrible." She looked at the ceiling briefly in the manner of someone recalibrating an estimate. "Huh," she said, and went to join the others in the sitting room. Harry finished his tea. The kitchen was quiet now, properly quiet, the after-dinner quiet that had its own texture, different from the morning quiet or the afternoon quiet. This one had the quality of completion, not resolution, not conclusion, just a day that had been fully occupied, arriving at its natural end. 7 people at a table, food passed in 7 directions, a sentence about comedy and architecture that had landed where it needed to, a second portion of pudding received and eaten without comment. Nothing extraordinary, nothing that would register from the outside as significant. Harry set his mug down. Through the sitting room doorway, he could hear all of them, Arthur and Ron, Ginny's voice now joining, the wireless low underneath everything. The lamp in the kitchen made the window behind the sink reflective, and he could see himself in it briefly, just a shape, indistinct, sitting at a table in a warm room. He stayed a little longer before going in to join them. The rain arrived sometime before dawn. Harry knew because he had been awake at the edge of it, not fully conscious, not dreaming, existing in the shallow intermediate layer that had become familiar to him over the past year, the place where sleep thinned and the mind ran quietly without direction. He had heard the first drops against the window before they became rain properly, the preliminary sound of isolated contact. And then the rain had gathered itself and arrived in full, and he had listened to it for a while before going back under. When he came downstairs, it was already mid-morning, and the garden was grey and silver, and the rain was steady. Molly was not in the kitchen. This was unusual enough that Harry noted it. The kitchen had acquired, over the weeks of his stay, the quality of a place that was always occupied, always warm, always in some stage of use. An empty kitchen at the Burrow had a slightly suspended feeling, like a stage between scenes. The stove was warm, but not active. The wireless was off. A note on the table in Molly's handwriting said, "Back by lunch," and named a destination Harry didn't catch because the ink had run slightly at one edge. He made tea. The kettle was already warm, recently used, Ginny probably, or Ron, if Ron had been up before 9, which was unusual but not impossible in certain weather conditions that made the garden uninviting and therefore removed his primary objection to waking. Harry filled the kettle properly and waited for it, watching the rain through the kitchen window. The garden under rain was a different place. The colours deepened, the green of the grass and the hedge going saturated, almost heavy, the way watercolour looks when the paper is wet. The flower beds Molly kept along the near wall had their heads down. The bird bath was filling. The fence Harry had, repaired, ran along the near edge of the garden, and the posts stood in their correct positions. The wood darkened with water, the nails he had driven still holding their angles in the soft morning light. The kettle boiled. He poured, found a mug, the same rotation of mugs on the draining board, always at least 3 in various stages. He picked the one nearest to hand. He did not have a plan for the day. This was not unusual. Most days this summer had not had plans, had accumulated their shape hour by hour from whatever presented itself. But rainy days had a particular quality of unstructure, a quality he was still learning to be inside of without friction. When the garden was available, there was always something. The fence, the shed, the orchard, the general texture of being outdoors in warm weather that required no justification. Rain removed that. Rain said, "Stay in." And staying in, Harry had discovered, required a slightly different set of skills. He carried his tea the sitting room. The room was empty and dim, the grey light from the windows making everything look softer than usual. The worn sofa, the crowded bookshelves, the family photographs on the mantelpiece that moved and waved and occasionally tried to get each other's attention. Arthur's newspaper from last night was still folded on the arm of his chair. A half-finished game of chess on the side table. Ron versus himself by the look of it. The pieces standing at various angles with the patient resignation of pieces waiting for a game to resume. Harry sat in the corner of the sofa nearest the window. The rain moved across the glass in the way of steady rain. Not dramatic, not sheeting, just present. A consistent sound against the window that was lower in pitch than he would have expected. Almost musical, almost the sound of the wireless on a quiet setting. He could see the garden from here at a different angle than from the kitchen. The apple trees at the edge of the orchard, visible past the hedge, their branches moving slightly. Molly had left the mug on the end table. It turned out to still have tea in it, barely warm. He moved it to the kitchen, came back, sat down again. He didn't read. He had a book upstairs. He had borrowed it from the shelf in Ron's room, an old Quidditch history with a broken spine that Ron had no memory of acquiring. But he didn't go up for it. He didn't want to read. He didn't want to do anything that required directing his attention toward a particular object. He wanted, he thought, just to sit. He sat. Ron came downstairs at 10:30. He appeared in the sitting room doorway in the unassembled way of someone who had woken up adequately, but not enthusiastically, took in the grey light and the rain and Harry on the sofa, and made a sound that communicated both his assessment of the weather and his intention to do nothing about it. He disappeared to the kitchen and returned with a mug of tea and settled into the armchair with the practiced ease of someone whose body knew this chair thoroughly. He looked at the chess pieces. "I was winning," he said. "You're playing yourself." "I was winning against myself." He picked up a knight, turned it over, set it back down in a different position. The piece moved itself back to where it had been, with an air of mild offense. "Hermione's coming on Thursday." Harry looked at him. "She wrote again this morning," Ron said to the chess pieces. "She wants to look at some places in London for, you know." He picked up the knight again. "Living." He said the word with the slight self-consciousness of someone who had not yet fully acclimatized to the size of what it referred to. "Good," Harry said. Ron looked up. "Is it?" "Yes," Harry said. "It's a good thing, Ron." Ron turned the knight over in his hand once more and set it down, and this time the piece stayed where he put it. He drank his tea. Outside, the rain went on. "What about you?" Ron said. Harry looked at the window. It was a question Ron asked occasionally, not often, not with pressure, in the same lateral way that Arthur noted things, placing it into conversation without insisting on it. "What about you?" The shape of the question was large, and Harry did not try to fit a large answer into it. "I don't know yet," he said. Ron nodded. This was, Harry thought, one of Ron's most underrated qualities, the ability to receive "I don't know yet" as a complete answer. Not an evasion, not a problem, just where things were. Ron had always been able to do this. It was possible he was better at it than almost anyone Harry knew. "The aura thing," Harry said after a moment. "Everyone keeps saying it." "Because it makes sense on paper," Ron said. "I know." He looked at the rain. "I don't think I want to do anything because it makes sense on paper. Not anymore." Ron was quiet for a moment. "What do you want?" he said. He said it simply, without the weight some people put into the question as though it were just a question. Harry turned his mug between his hands. "I don't know," he said. "Something with my hands in it, maybe." He thought of the fence, the carrots, the shed, and the objects on the shelf, and the specific satisfaction of a nail driven straight. Something that you can see when it's done. Ron looked at the chessboard with an expression of private consideration. "That doesn't sound like being an aura," he said. "No," Harry agreed. "Sounds more like being Dad, actually." Harry looked at the window. Outside, a wood pigeon had settled on the fence post nearest the garden, the one Harry had repaired on the first morning, the one that had been the worst of them. It sat in the rain with the compact, impervious quality of a bird that had decided the weather was simply the weather. "I think that might be all right," Harry said. The rain continued through the late morning and into the afternoon. Ginny came down at some point and made eggs, which she brought to the sitting room on 2 plates without asking, handing one to Harry and one to Ron, and eating her own standing in the doorway, looking at the rain. George came through at noon, moving with the quiet economy of someone who had somewhere to be in a general sense, and was moving toward it, and exchanged a brief wordless acknowledgement with Ron involving the lifting of chins, and went back upstairs with a plate of toast. Arthur returned first, coming in through the back door with his jacket dark with rain and a satisfied expression that suggested whatever he had been doing had gone well. He stood at the kitchen door, removing his jacket and telling the room in general about a conversation he'd had with someone at the improper use of magic office who had, apparently, made an interesting observation about enchanted umbrellas. Harry listened from the sitting room and found he was smiling slightly. Molly came in 20 minutes after Arthur, set 3 bags on the kitchen table, and moved through the house with the particular energy of someone whose afternoon had been fully occupied and was now transitioning into the equally occupied business of the evening. She paused briefly in the sitting room doorway, looked at Harry on the sofa and Ron in the chair and the grey rain beyond the window, and said, "Nobody went outside then," in the tone of someone confirming a fact they had expected. "It rained," Ron said. "I had noticed," Molly said, and went back to the kitchen. Harry stayed on the sofa through the afternoon. He had his tea, which was periodically replaced by some mechanism he did not fully track, a fresh mug appearing on the end table whenever the previous one had been empty for long enough. He watched the rain. He did not read. He did not plan. He was aware at intervals of the sounds of the house around him, the kitchen active again, footsteps above, the return of the wireless at its customary low setting, the intermittent sounds of a household conducting its ordinary afternoon. The wood pigeon was still on the fence post. It had been there for nearly an hour, or a different wood pigeon had taken its place without Harry noticing, which was possible. It sat with its feathers slightly puffed, facing into the light from the west, where the rain was thinning at the horizon. Harry watched it watch the garden. He thought about what he had said to Ron, "Something with my hands in it," and turned the thought over in a quiet way, without urgency. He did not need to know what it meant yet, what shape it would take. It was early. There was time. The split plank on the fence needed doing tomorrow if the rain stopped. That was enough for now. That was something he could see from here, something real and specific, with a clear before and after. Tomorrow, the plank. Whatever came after that could come after that. The rain against the window went on with its low, steady sound. He let his eyes go slightly unfocused, not sleeping, just loosening, and the garden went soft in the grey afternoon light, and the sound of the house continued around him, and he stayed where he was and let the day move through its hours without resistance. He thought of nothing in particular. That was, he was finding, its own kind of practice, like driving a nail straight. You bent a few first, found the angle, and then slowly, with repetition, the nothing became something you could hold. He sat with the rain. The morning after the rain was clean. That was the word that arrived in Harry's mind when he stepped out the back door into the garden. Not fresh, not bright, though it was both of those things, but clean, the way air is clean when everything that had been suspended in it has been settled by water and the world has been returned to its simplest version of itself. The grass was dark with moisture. The stones of the garden path were nearly black. The sky above the apple trees was pale and particular, the kind of blue that only existed in the hour before the sun was properly established, before the heat arrived and softened it. He had his tea in one hand. He stood on the back step for a moment, not moving toward anything, just standing in it. The garden smelled of wet earth and something else, something green and faintly sweet that came from the hedge when it was wet, that he had noticed before, but not thought to name. He didn't name it now. He just breathed it in and looked at the garden in its clean morning state and drank his tea. The fence ran along the near edge of the grass. He could see it from here. The repaired posts standing correctly, the wood still dark from yesterday's rain. And there, toward the left end, the split plank he had been meaning to do since the first morning. It had held through the summer so far, through the heat, and now through the rain, the nail he'd driven through the crosspiece still doing its temporary work. But he could see from here that the split had widened slightly since he'd last looked, the rain getting in overnight, working at the wood the way rain works at wood, patient and indifferent. Today then, he finished his tea on the step and went inside to get the tools. Arthur's box was where it always was, under the kitchen steps. Harry carried it out to the garden and set it on the path beside the fence and crouched down to look at the plank properly. Up close, it was worse than it had appeared from the step. The split ran nearly a third of the length of the board now, the wood fibers separating with the slight springiness of something that had been stressed for too long. The temporary nail had held the crosspiece in place, but had allowed the plank itself to flex, and flexing over weeks in varying weather had done what flexing does. He would need to replace it. He went back to the shed, the door making its sound, low and familiar, and found the lumber offcuts that Arthur kept stacked against the far wall, pieces of varying lengths left over from previous repairs. He sorted through them until he found one close to the right dimensions, slightly longer than needed, which was better than slightly shorter. He carried it back to the fence. The work required both hands and most of his attention. He removed the damaged plank first, the temporary nail, then the original fixings, 3 of them, which had rusted in their holes and required patience. The plank came away in 2 pieces where the split had been, which confirmed the decision. He set the pieces aside in the grass. The new plank needed trimming at one end. He didn't have a saw in the toolbox, but he found one hanging on the shed wall between a trowel and a coil of garden wire and brought it back, and the trimming took longer than expected and went slightly crooked, but not crooked enough to matter. He fitted the plank into the gap, checked the alignment. It sat slightly proud on one side. He adjusted, checked again. Then he drove the nails. The garden was still quiet around him. The rest of the house had not yet properly started. He could hear, distantly, the first sounds of the kitchen, the kettle, something placed on the counter, which meant Molly was up, which meant the day was beginning to assemble itself in its usual increments. A sparrow landed on the fence post 3 sections down, looked at him without particular interest, and flew away. Harry drove the final nail flush with the wood. He sat back on his heels and looked at the new plank. The wood was lighter than the surrounding planks, younger, its surface not yet weathered to the same grey-brown that the rest of the fence had become over years of seasons. It stood out. It would not stand out forever. The weather would work on it, and eventually it would match, or match closely enough that only someone looking deliberately would notice. He ran his hand along it. The surface was smooth and firm, the nails correctly seated, the fit at both edges tight. not a perfect repair. The trimming had left the cut end with a slight angle that he could feel if he pressed his thumbnail against it, but a solid one, something that would hold. He thought, they don't need to be perfect, they just need to hold. He gathered the tools and put them back in the box. He was still crouching beside the fence when the back door opened. Ginny came out in her Quidditch kit, broom over her shoulder, mug in her other hand, moving with the early morning quality she had when she had been up for a while already. Her focus directed inward, toward whatever she was working out before she started flying. She crossed the garden path, glanced at the fence, glanced at Harry beside it. "New plank," she said. "Needed doing." She looked at it for a moment with the same evaluative attention her mother used for things that had been repaired, the instinct to assess whether the repair was equal to the original problem. Whatever she concluded, she moved on. "It'll rain again Thursday," she said. Dad heard it from someone at the ministry. "It'll be dry by then," Harry said. She looked at him briefly, that direct look, fully present, briefly given. Then she went on across the garden toward the orchard, and the apple trees received her, and he heard the particular sound of her broom lifting, and then she was above the trees, and the sound changed and became the sound of Ginny flying, which was its own specific thing, recognizable and continuous. Harry picked up the toolbox and carried it back to the shed. When he came into the kitchen, Molly was at the stove, and the wireless was on at its low morning register, and there was tea in the pot, still hot. He poured a mug and stood at the window with it, looking out at the garden. The fence ran the length of the near side, all of it repaired now. The posts straight, the planks holding. The new wood at the left end, slightly lighter than the rest. The garden path was still dark from the overnight rain, but the sun was beginning to reach it, and he could see the darkness receding as he watched, slowly, the stones returning to their ordinary pale grey. The lawnmower had started on the back lawn, making its slow, diagonal rows. A gnome appeared at the base of the apple tree nearest the fence, and assessed the situation with the suspicious squint of a gnome that suspected it was being watched, decided it probably wasn't, and moved on. Everything going on as it went on. Molly said, without turning from the stove, "The others will be down by 8:30. Will you stay for the week?" It was said in exactly the tone of the kitchen, unhurried, plainly placed, not asking for anything beyond the simple logistical answer. She was already turning back to whatever she was making, as though the answer were a minor detail to be confirmed before moving on to the more pressing business of breakfast. Harry looked at the new plank, at the repaired fence running the length of the garden, straight and sufficient, holding what it was supposed to hold. "Yes," he said. Molly nodded once, and that was that. He took his tea to the table and sat down. From the orchard, above the hedge and the apple trees, Ginny's broom cut its clean line against the pale morning sky, back and forth, the sound of it steady and unhurried and already familiar. Smoke began to rise from the chimney. The fence stood in the clean morning light. And in the kitchen of the burrow, on an ordinary morning after rain, with breakfast beginning and the household waking and the day not yet decided, Harry Potter sat at the table with his tea and waited for nothing in particular, which was, he was learning, exactly enough.